Good evening. Today's Bible study comes from Mark chapter 2, verses 23 through 28. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" He answered, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat, and he also gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Now, when we look at this, first we'll go across the surface. It tells you on one Sabbath day, Jesus was going through the grain fields. They had been walking from town to town. And as his disciples were walking along, they began to pick some heads of grain. They were just picking the tops of grain, and it wasn't like they were doing any type of so-called work that the Pharisees would think they were doing. But the Pharisees said to them, "Look, why are they doing what it is unlawful on the Sabbath?" Well, the Pharisees were trying to compare them picking these kernels of grain to them cultivating a field, which was considered true work. And the Pharisees had some problems all the time, and they wanted this to be considered work. And if you look at it, it's ridiculous. Um, it would be the same as if they had picked a flower. They didn't cultivate a field; they picked a flower. But of course, what they wanted was that the disciples and Jesus be charged with violating the Sabbath day, which was crazy. And you can see as they walked along to have charged them with irrigating land on the Sabbath. First of all, they didn't irrigate it at all. It is crystal clear that Jesus' disciples did not do anything of that nature. And whatever, they didn't violate the Sabbath laws of God. What they did violate was them stupid Pharisees rules. These were rules that the Pharisees made themselves, and they were hypocrites to these rules. They had self-imposed rules that they put on people, and they didn't do God's law. So they were hypocrites not only to impose their own rules, but then to put God's rules on other people and not themselves. So it says, "And the Pharisees said unto him, Behold, why do they on the Sabbath day that which is not unlawful?" Why do they on the Sabbath day which is unlawful? Well, this verse is just crazy to me because the Pharisees are asking the question to what they didn't do. God's Sabbath day had not been violated at all. But if you look at them petty regulations that the Pharisees had, now they had been violated. The legislation that they had imposed was clouded. Of course, their human regulations, they tried to equate to and with God's law. Wrong answer. But we shouldn't fall into such an error or a trap. And Christ wasn't. Christ said this very incident that his disciples were guiltless. And you can see that in Matthew 12:7. But then it says, "And he said unto them, Did you never read what David did when he had need and was hungry? He and they that were with him." We remember David and his crew came and ate. They were hungry. And they were eating food that they were not supposed to. It was consecrated for the priests. And David did indeed do an unlawful thing to which Christ referred. But why? Why would Jesus cite this example? I think he was saying, look, David sinned, therefore it is all right for us to sin. Nah, that's not it. Christ was not justifying his disciples. There was no need to on the basis that everybody else had done something else either. When he brought up David's conduct, and when it was being brought up here, it was to show how unreasonable the partiality of the Pharisees were in their judgments. David was a violator. He violated, and they approved of it. They approved of David's violation, and David ate consecrated bread that was supposed to be for the priest only. The disciples didn't do any work. They pulled kernels of wheat off. But they didn't look at David, they just looked at Christ. And as they said, Jesus' disciples did Sabbath breaking. And then he speaks to how he entered into the house of God where Abiathar was high priest. And then it tells you exactly what David did with his men. So they had violated the whole way round. And then Jesus said, and he said unto them in verse 27, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath, so that the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. When you see the Sabbath made for man, not man for Sabbath, this is a reference to the Sabbath day. As God made it and as the Pharisees made it, God indeed had made it for man. It was a day of rest for us. And quite early in time when he made it, the Sabbath law, a man decided that his human needs took precedence over it, picking up sticks on the Sabbath. Did God approve of such conduct? He commanded Israel to stone the man to death. Christ was one with the Father, and it cannot be argued that Jesus was here critical of the way God made the Sabbath for man. And he was telling them God made it for man to rest on that day. The Pharisees, with their unbelieving and furloughs regarding Sabbath keeping, they forgot all the God-given laws concerning it, to include an entire, and I mean a huge thing of do's and don'ts. And it was man's way, so there's no need for me to even keep justifying or talking about it. The Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Son of Man is used in this passage, and remember it was in Psalm 8, is merely a synonym for man. But that should not be allowed to say Jesus' use of the word in a unique sense are only to himself. And when Christ uses this title, it refers to one who has the power to forgive sins. And you can see that in Mark 2 and 10. So he's speaking to him of himself, hence himself as God. Jesus meant everything by this little title that he meant by the Son of God. The evident reason for him being the Son of Man deriving from its freedom from these worldly thoughts that these Pharisees were putting out, the things that were in their minds. So Jesus was telling them, I am Lord of the Sabbath. The Sabbath is not Lord of me. And apart from the fact that no violation of God's Sabbath law had happened, there was the additional truth that Jesus' disciples were exempted from God's true Sabbath laws due to their being in the service of Jesus Christ. Matthew records, emphasizes this. Now don't forget the Pharisees were still mad, but the Lord expects you to do good all the time. And feeding yourself, you're allowed to do on the Sabbath. And it tells you this too because the Sabbath law did not apply to servants of the temple who every Sabbath day continually did things which in any other service would have been Sabbath violations. After putting this out, Jesus said that one greater than the temple is here. One greater than the temple is here. That is Jesus the Christ. The same being a reference to himself. Therefore, the apostles in his service were even more entitled to exemption from the true Sabbath restrictions than even were the Pharisees who served in their temple, inasmuch as Christ was and is the greater temple. If you look at Matthew 12:5, it says, "Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple break the Sabbath and are innocent?" The priest in the temple, Jesus is the high priest. And remember, if Jesus wasn't Lord of the Sabbath, then he couldn't have the equality derived from his oneness and equality with God. He was in the process of abolishing the Sabbath institution altogether. He would nail it to his cross, abolishing it totally and completely, and his words were a prophecy of that very thing. Amen.